Chapter 1. The Last Great Victory. The wind came down out of the north, like a butcher's knife. It skinned the hills of what little warmth they possessed, drove needles of ice into the eyes of men and beasts, and sent streamers of ash-grey snow chasing one another over the hard ground. Beyond that waste of frozen heather and black stone, the settlement of Khalt clung to the borderlands like a scab, a ring of timber palisades, squat long houses hunched beneath their own roofs, and a little hilltop shrine where a bronze bell tolled thinly in the cold. Smoke rose from the chimneys in weak, wavering threads. It might have looked peaceful from a distance, almost pitiful in its smallness. Vardek Krana saw only prey. He stood upon the ridge above the settlement, with his warband spread behind him, a line of iron and fur and horned silhouettes, half lost in the blowing snow. He was taller than any of them by a head, broad as an ox, and clad from throat to heel in black plate that looked less forged than grown, overlapping scales of darkened iron, chased with runes that seemed to crawl when not looked at straight. A ragged cloak of flayed banners snapped behind him, each strip stiff with old gore. His helm was a snarling face of iron, the cheek plates fused to his flesh long ago so that his breath steamed out between metallic teeth. In his right fist he held his axe, God-cleaver, its crescent blade black as starless ice, and slick with a sheen that was never wholly rust and never wholly blood. He could smell the people below even through the snow, wood smoke, dung, tallow, sickness, fear, mortal stink, Southron stink. It made his lip curl beneath the prison of his helm. Behind him his warriors muttered and shifted, iron clinking, leather groaning, the lean chaos hounds straining at their chains. Some wore helms crowned with antlers or tusks. Others had the little gifts of the gods plain upon them already, an extra eye filmed white in the brow, fingers like hooked talons, patches of scaled flesh glistening wet at the throat. Men who had killed for years beneath black banners, raided through Kislevite hamlets and border forts, and lived by the strong law of blood and terror. They watched Vardek with the hungry devotion of wolves, watching the largest wolf among them. At his left stood Sitha Croweye, wrapped in layered rags the color of old bruises. Her hood was low, but the lower half of her face showed as a knot of scar tissue and thin blue lips. One eye was a normal thing, dark and watchful. The other bulged from a nest of puckered flesh and milky veins, too large for the socket, turning this way and that as though it sought things the world had wisely hidden. Strings of bone fetishes and finger joints dangled from her wrists and clicked softly in the wind. "The omens shriek," she said, and her voice was dry as grave dust. "Not all teeth bared in delight are smiles." Vardek did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on Khalt. "Then let them shriek louder. I would hear the gods over the dying." Sitha's white eye rolled toward him. "They watch with hunger." He laughed, and the sound that came through the iron mask was like stone breaking. "As do I. That is why they favor me." Below them, the bell on the hill shrine tolled again, a warning this time. Some shepherd or woodcutter had seen shapes moving on the ridge and gone bawling into the settlement. Tiny figures ran across the hard-packed snow between houses, men with spears, a few archers stumbling toward the gate in sheepskin cloaks, all panic and disorder. Vardek could have pitied them if pity had not soured in him years ago. Instead he raised God-cleaver. The warband's muttering ceased at once. Even the hounds stopped their snarling and nearly trembled. "Look there," Vardek growled. Walls of pine, men of straw, a shrine to weakling gods who keep their worshippers cold and hungry. Break them, burn them, heap their skulls while the blood is hot. Let the carrion have what remains. He lowered the axe and roared one word. The ridge vomited murder. They plunged downslope in a black wave, boots thundering, shields smashing against breastplates, voices rising in a war cry that had no language left in it, only appetite. The hounds were unleashed first, hideous things with patchy fur, blind white eyes and jaws too wide for their skulls. They bounded through the drifts, foam stringing from their chops. Arrows hissed up from below, vanishing into snow and armor. One warrior pitched backward with a shaft in his throat, but he only kicked and gargled while the rest ran over him. Vardek reached the palisade before the defenders had drawn breath for a second volley. A militiaman thrust a spear through the gap in the gate timbers. Vardek caught the shaft under one arm, yanked the man bodily into the splintered seam, and drove Godcleaver down. The axe bit through wood, through fingers, through skull. The blow split the gatepost to the iron banding. Blood sprayed in a hot arc across the snow and struck the ground hissing. Where it landed, the snow melted black. Thin red lines spread outward in jagged curves, etching themselves into the drifts, runes, not scratched by any hand, but seething up from the pooled gore itself. The men nearest Vardek saw them and bellowed in exultation. "Favoured!" screamed one of his champions, a scarred brute named Khalt. "Favoured of the gods!" Vardek grinned behind iron and rammed shoulder first into the gate. The timbers burst inward under the impact, as though a battering ram had struck them. He stormed through splinters and screaming men into the main lane of Khalt. Then the slaughter became honest. He hacked down the first rank of defenders before they could settle their shields. A young spearman in a wolfskin cap took the axe in his collarbone and came apart to the sternum. A second man lunged for Vardek's gut and found only black plate. Vardek stamped his knee backward until the leg bent wrong, then buried the bearded edge in his face. Every blow of Godcleaver had a weight beyond iron. It smashed through shield rims, stove in helms, broke ribs like kindling. Vardek felt each impact race up his arm as a pulse of savage joy. The weapon did not jar in his grip. It drank force and returned more. Around him the warband tore into the settlement. Chaos hounds dragged a woman into the slush by her shawl and opened her belly while she shrieked. Khalt and 3 others hewed down the gate guard and stormed toward the longhouses, kicking doors from hinges and hauling out whoever cowered within. One roof caught fire, then another. Orange light bloomed against the white waste, painting the snow with feverish color. The garrison rallied in the square before the shrine hill, perhaps 30 men in mismatched mail and boiled leather, under the command of an old officer wearing a fox fur mantle and carrying a notched sword. He had the courage to stand, which was almost admirable. He bellowed at his men to lock shields. Archers knelt behind them. Somewhere children were crying in one of the houses. Somewhere an ox wailed as flames reached its stall. Vardek strode into the square through smoke and flurrying snow, his boots leaving red-black prints. The old officer pointed his sword. "Hold! Hold, you dogs!" Arrows flew. 2 shattered on Vardek's breastplate. One lodged in the thick fur at his shoulder. Another struck the slit of his helm and glanced away with a scream of metal. He barely noticed. He came on at a measured pace, not running now, letting them see what hunted them, letting the terror ripen. The officer charged first, perhaps to prove to his men that courage still meant something in the world. He was fast for his age. His sword whipped down in a silver arc aimed at Vardek's neck. Vardek caught the blade on the haft of Godcleaver, twisted, and broke the man's wrist with the back of his gauntlet. Bone cracked. The officer cried out. Vardek stepped in close enough to smell onions and sour ale on his breath, then smashed his helm into the man's nose. As the officer reeled, Vardek drove the axe clean through his chest and lifted him from the ground. The remaining defenders faltered. Vardek wrenched the blade free, and the corpse hit the snow-pumping blood. Again the red steamed. Again it hissed and crawled into shapes, loops and hooks, and eye-like sigils spread across the square in a widening stain. Above, from somewhere unseen in the grey sky, came the croaking of birds. Carrion crows swept down out of the storm in a wheeling black flock. They did not descend upon the dead. They circled overhead in a pattern so precise it prickled the skin even through armor. 4 spirals twisting around a central void. Warriors and villagers alike looked up. Even the archers forgot to loose. The crows turned and turned, cawing hoarsely, and with each circuit the square seemed to darken, though the snow still fell bright all around. Vardek spread his arms to the omen. "Behold!" he roared. "They mark me." His warband answered with a thunder of approval. The defenders broke. It became running murder after that. Men threw down spears and fled between the houses, only to be cut down in doorways or hunted through their own animal pens. Vardek hacked through the shield wall's remains and climbed the shrine hill with 6 of his best killers at his back. The shrine itself was a low stone thing crusted with rime, its lintel carved in some provincial style of sunbursts and wheat sheaves. A priest stood before the bronze bell in wool robes, clutching a hammer and shaking hands. He rang the bell once. The note was thin and desperate and lasted only a heartbeat. Vardek sheared the bell rope with one blow, then backhanded the priest so hard he fell against the altar and lost 3 teeth. The little holy icons inside the shrine were cheap carvings painted in faded colors, domestic gods, harvest spirits, timid protectors of barns and births and hearth fires. Vardek despised them on sight. He smashed the altar with his axe, split the icons beneath his boots, and tore down the hanging charms, while his men dragged out the priest and anyone foolish enough to have taken shelter there. "Pile them," he commanded. They did. Captives were brought to the square with wrists bound in rope or belts, stumbling barefoot through slush darkened by blood. Farmers, women, 2 old men, 1 boy, perhaps 13 winters old, who stared at Vardek with such naked hatred it almost made him laugh. Fires spread from house to house. Smoke rolled low, greasy and black. The bronze bell, knocked from its frame, lay dented in the snow and reflected flames across its curve like liquid gold. Sitha came up the hill at last, moving with an odd bird-like gait. Her rags snapped around her thin frame. She looked at the burning houses, at the crawled blood runes, at the crows overhead that still wheeled in patient circles. "Strong signs," she said. Vardek turned toward her. His axe dripped red. "Say it plain." Her good eye held him. "A beast may be fed before it is bled." He snorted. "Your warnings grow stale, crone. They are fresh as opened guts." She looked to the captives. "You hear praise where there is only attention. Attention is enough." He strode down from the shrine. "A man noticed by gods is already half immortal." He took the boy first, because of the stare. Vardek seized him by the hair, dragged his head back, and opened his throat upon the broken altar stone. The blood ran in a steaming sheet. The captives began sobbing and praying. One of Vardek's warriors laughed, until tears stood in his eyes. One by one the prisoners were cut, stabbed, disemboweled, or offered screaming to the hounds while the warband chanted and struck axe hafts on shields. Blood ran in channels between the frozen ruts of the square. Everywhere it touched the snow, it hissed and wrote. By the end, the square was a red ruin. The shrine burned bright as a pyre. The crows descended at last to feast, bold as courtiers. Vardek stood amid it all, breathing hard, steam rolling from his helm. He felt a fierce buoyancy in his chest, a sense of nearness so keen it seemed the world's skin had thinned. This was no mere raid. This was declaration. He had led many victories, yes, but this one bore the scent of destiny. The omens had clustered too thick to ignore. The runes, the birds, the strength in his arm, the delicious ease of killing. He could almost feel unseen eyes upon him, vast and amused and appraising. Daemonhood. Why not? He had spilled enough blood to float a longship, burned enough temples to light a province, broken rivals beneath his boots, and worn favor like a second skin. He had been patient where lesser champions became reckless, merciless where they became sentimental. There were men in the wastes who had ascended for less. As the dead crackled in the firelight, one of the surviving villagers, a woman with half her hair burned away, babbled through broken teeth of a place in the mountains. She spoke because Khalt had cut off her husband's hands and laid them in her lap. Between sobs she told of an old barrow high in the teeth of the northern peaks, a place the locals shunned, where stones older than any kingdom stood around a sealed mound. Shepherds had found strange lights there on moonless nights. Once, long ago, grave robbers had dug into it and come back with skin blistered black, raving that something inside whispered in 4 voices from behind walls of earth. Scytha listened, her head tilted slightly, like a bird hearing worms stir under soil. Vardek listened too, and what he heard was not peasant superstition but invitation. A relic touched by chaos in ages past, hidden, waiting. A treasure no weakling priest or rival champion had yet dared claim. He saw at once what must be done. He would take it from the mountain tomb, bear it back beneath black banners, and offer it atop a mound of skulls, so high the crows would seem pebbles around its summit. Then the gods would have to reward him, not merely with another little gift, another mutation or fever dream, but with true immortality, apotheosis, a place among nightmare. By dusk, Khalt was a carcass. By night, it was a feast hall. The largest longhouse still standing had been claimed for Vardek and his chosen killers. The corpses had been dragged out or heaped in a side room. Fires roared in the central hearths. Meat goat, horse, perhaps man in places turned on spits. Ale casks had been broken open. Warriors drank from bowls, helmets, cupped hands. They shouted, brawled, boasted, and sang foul songs while severed heads looked on from the rafters. Outside, the rest of the settlement smoldered under the snowfall. The red glow of embers shone through the chinks in the walls like banked hellfire. Vardek sat in the place of honor at the high table, bareheaded now. His hair was black, and rope thick, hanging to his shoulders. Old scars latticed his scalp and cheeks. His face was hard and broad, the nose flattened by old breaks, the eyes pale as glacier water and empty of softness. He drank deep, wiped blood and grease from his beard with the back of his hand, and listened to his warriors praise him. "Did you see the gate?" one was saying. "Burst like rotten cratewood." "And the runes," another slurred. "I swear, on my mother's flensed hide, they wrote his name." "Not his name," Khalt growled. "Something greater." Sitha sat apart from the revel, close to the wall where the firelight scarcely touched her. She had not eaten. Her strange eye watched Vardek without blinking. He had shed his left gauntlet to drink, but kept the right on, still wrapped around the haft of God-cleaver where it rested across his knees. The metal felt warm, warmer than the hall, warm as flesh. He tightened his grip and felt, for an instant, a pulse answer him from within the iron. Then pain lanced through his forearm. Not a crippling pain, not even a truly unwelcome one. A hot, liquid ache, like a brand pressed lovingly to the meat. Vardek's head snapped down. The warriors nearby fell silent. Before their eyes, the black metal of the gauntlet seemed to sink into his wrist. The seams vanished. Iron merged with flesh, without blood, without resistance, as though it had at last found the shape it had longed to hold. The knuckles spread into a ridged, monstrous permanence over his hand and forearm. Veins swelled black beneath the skin above the vambrace. Vardek rose with a roar, not of agony but triumph. "See," he thundered. "See how they mark me." The hall erupted. Men slammed bowls on tables and screamed his name. Khalt dropped to one knee. Others followed suit, grinning, weeping, hammering fists to chests. Vardek lifted the fused arm high and laughed like an avalanche breaking loose. His blood ran hot as forge metal. In the freezing draught that stole under the walls, steam rose from him in pale ribbons. But across the room Sitha did not kneel. She stood instead, very slowly, her rags whispering, her good eye narrowed, her swollen white eye widened until the veins around it trembled. Vardek saw her expression then, not awe, not even fear, but a grim and private recognition. For just one heartbeat, as the steam curled from his skin and the warband howled its devotion, he felt something move beneath the armor on his sword arm. Not the shift of muscle, not the pull of tendon. Something softer, smaller, restless, a crawling beneath the flesh. Sitha's lips peeled back from her teeth. At the edge of the firelight, where no one else could hear her over the revels, she whispered to the dark, "It begins." Chapter 2. The Relic in the Barrow. They left the ruins of Khalt under a sky the color of old iron. What remained of the settlement smoldered behind them in the dawn, a blackened wound in the white land, its pyres coughing grease-heavy smoke into the bitter air. Vardek Crane did not look back. Men who looked backward grew soft, or cautious, or haunted. All three were weaknesses, and weakness was a language the gods answered only with mockery. He marched at the head of his warband with Godcleaver, resting against one shoulder, and his fused gauntlet black as a charred stump around the haft, steam still whispering from the seams where iron had become flesh. The snow crunched beneath his boots. The wind worried at his cloak of flayed banners and pulled the stink of soot and blood after them like a long banner of its own. Ahead loomed the mountains. They rose from the borderland like the spine of some world beast buried in the earth, jagged ridges of dark stone and ice, serrated against a low sky. Clouds dragged themselves across the peaks like torn guts. Somewhere among those heights lay the barrow the peasant woman had wept of, an ancient mound, circled by stones older than kingdoms, a place avoided by shepherds and thieves and fools, with enough instinct left in them to fear what they could not name. If there was truth in the tale, something power-soaked had slept there since elder days, entombed beneath frost and rock and the weight of forgotten years. Vardek intended to wake it and chain its meaning to his own destiny. His warband followed in a long, ill-tempered column, less joyous now than they had been after the sack of Khalt. Victory fury had burned low. Hunger, cold, and fatigue gnawed at them again. They dragged sledges laden with stolen food, casks, furs, bronze trinkets, and severed heads hung by the hair as trophies. The hounds loped around the flanks, ribs showing through patchy fur, snapping at one another over frozen strips of meat. Some of the warriors cast glances at Vardek's fused arm when they thought he would not notice. Others stared openly, their faces lit by greed and reverence in equal measure. Gifts drew followers. They also drew challengers. Scyther Crow-Eye walked among them in her rag layers, her bone fetishes clattering softly. She had said little since Khalt. Sometimes her milky eye rolled up toward the peaks, as though watching shapes move in the clouds. Sometimes she muttered to herself in a language none of them knew, or perhaps no language at all. Men edged away from her when she passed. Even Chaos Men had superstitions, especially Chaos Men. On the second day, the weather worsened. By noon, the snow came not in flakes, but in hard-driven sheets, a white wall, smashing itself against stone and flesh alike. The wind became a living thing, shrieking through gullies and over cliff faces with the voice of something vast and starved. It clawed heat from lungs and feeling from fingers. The world narrowed to what lay 3 paces ahead and the black backs of the men in front. The mountain paths were little better than goat tracks skirting drops that vanished into white emptiness. Twice, a warrior slipped and went over the edge, his scream cut short by distance and the storm's indifference. No one stopped. Vardek did not even turn his head. By dusk, the men were muttering openly. "We should make camp. Storm's too thick. The barrow won't walk away. The gods can wait a night." Vardek heard each complaint as clearly as if spoken into his ear. He said nothing until one of the weaker northerners, a bent-shouldered reaver named Dren, let his stolen shield fall and sat down in the snow with a groan. He was shivering so hard his teeth rattled like dice in a cup. "Can't," Dren gasped. "Can't feel my feet." The column slowed. Irritation spread through it, quick as rot. Vardek turned and walked back through the line, snow hissing against his armor. He stopped over the seated man. Dren looked up through ice-rimmed lashes. "Lord, just a little." Vardek buried Godcleaver in his collarbone. The blade punched through fur, flesh, and rib with a wet, chopping sound. Dren convulsed once and sprawled backward, blood spreading black under him before the storm began to cover it. Vardek planted a boot on the corpse and wrenched the axe free. "No one sits," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. In the shrieking storm it carried anyway, iron-hard and simple. No one slows. Anyone who cannot climb can feed the mountain. He pointed with the axe at 2 more lagging warriors, whose eyes had grown hollow and doubtful. "You, Drag him off the path. They obeyed at once. Fear warmed where fire could not, so they climbed. Men stumbled forward with raw faces and split lips, driven by whip-crack curses and spear butts in the back. When one of the sledges overturned on a narrow ledge, spilling casks and frozen meat into a ravine, Vardek took the teamster's right hand for clumsiness and made him carry on bleeding into the snow. He did not relent when the night came down blue and murderous. Torches guttered uselessly in the gale, little more than orange ghosts. The mountainsides groaned and cracked under old drifts. More than once, distant avalanches muttered like sleeping gods turning in their beds. When at last they sheltered beneath an overhang of black rock, no one thanked him for the halt. They simply collapsed where they stood, huddling into cloaks, gnawing hard bread and frozen strips of flesh, too exhausted even to boast. Vardek remained standing at the mouth of the shelter, looking out at the storm. His fused gauntlet ached with a deep hot throb that seemed almost eager. Somewhere in that screaming white waste, he felt certain something old and foul was waiting and listening. Behind him, Hoth Baal watched from the fire. Roth was one of Vardek's lieutenants, a thick-bodied killer with a scalp tattooed in blue spirals and a beard woven through with brass rings. A white scar ran from the corner of his mouth to the lobe of one ear, giving him the appearance of wearing half a grin even in stillness. He was a proven butcher, an able leader in a charge, and savage in close work. But Vardek had long since marked the thing beneath those virtues: ambition without patience. Roth laughed too quickly at other men's doubts. He stood too straight whenever Vardek spoke of destiny. He had the eyes of a man forever measuring the distance between himself and another's throat. In the morning, the first of the trolls came for them. They found the warband while the column wound through a narrow defile between cliffs streaked with blue ice. The beasts had likely been stalking them since dawn, drawn by blood and the smell of cooked meat on gear and cloaks. Starvation had made them bold. The first warning was the disappearance of a hound, jerked upward into a crevice with a yelp and a spray of dark blood. Then came the bellow, a wet, mucus-thick roar that shivered off the rock walls. 3 trolls lumbered out of the blowing snow. They were huge, long-armed things with sagging bellies and skin the color of pond scum gone rotten. Their backs were crusted with ice and old scars. One had a lower jaw hanging in strips from some ancient wound, exposing tusk-like teeth slick with drool. Another's left eye was sealed under a boil of scar tissue, but the right was small, cruel, and hungry. They stank of filth, stagnant water, and the meat pit. The column erupted into shouts, spears lowered. A few men tried to back away down the path, only to jam against those behind them. The lead troll swung one arm like a club and caved in a warrior's chest so completely his spine burst through his back in a spray of red and white. Another snatched up a screaming man by the legs and bit him across the middle. Entrails spilled steaming into the snow. Vardek was already moving. He hit the first troll at a run, Godcleaver taking it in the knee. Bone cracked. The creature collapsed with a howl, one hand slamming out blindly. Vardek ducked under the sweep and hacked into its throat. Black-green blood sheeted over him, stinking like opened graves. The troll's flesh tried to knit even as he split it. He chopped again and again until the head lolled by strings. Around him the defile became slaughter. Warriors stabbed and hacked at rubbery hides that closed around spearheads. A troll seized Khalt by the face, fingers sinking into eye sockets, and hurled him against the cliff hard enough to dent his breastplate. Hrothbael leapt onto another beast's back and sawed at its neck while it thrashed and smashed men flat beneath its feet. Sitha stood off the path in a drift, her rags whipping, croaking words that made Frostfeather outward in strange branching lines. One troll turned toward her and abruptly froze mid-step, not dead but locked in a convulsion, its limbs jerking as if strings had been tied to every nerve. Vardek finished the first monster by splitting its skull to the teeth. He tore free his axe and bellowed for the others to bring fire. Torches were thrust against troll flesh. Fat sizzled. Regenerating wounds hissed and blistered. The path filled with a stink of cooking corruption. At last the creatures went down in heaps of twitching meat. They lost 7 men to the fight, perhaps more, if the one dragged away into the blizzard lived long enough to count. Vardek allowed the survivors to carve meat from the dead trolls, though the smarter among them did so with reluctance. Hunger overruled disgust. They roasted strips over smoky fires at noon, and the flesh popped and oozed like diseased fat. Men who ate it looked ill afterward, but none complained where he could hear. By the 4th day they came upon the tribe. The mountains had a way of hiding human life, until one nearly walked into it, and so it was with the cannibals. The warband entered a narrow hanging valley ringed with wind-twisted pines, and found a cluster of hide tents, cooking pits and stakes, adorned not with antlers or charms, but with stripped human bones. Skulls had been stacked in cairns, fingers dangled on cords. A smell of rancid grease lay heavy over everything. The tribe came shrieking from the trees before the warband could form a proper line. They were mountain savages gone to feral ruin, naked save for greasy furs and strings of teeth, their skin painted with soot and old blood. Some wore masks made from flensed faces dried hard into leather. Women fought beside the men, and children with sharpened bones darted among them like rats. Their god, if they had one, was hunger. They rushed in mad with it, hurling stones and javelins, trying to drag down stragglers and bite at exposed hands. The fight was ugly, close and savage. A cannibal woman leapt onto a warrior's back and tore out his throat with filed teeth. Khalt crushed a boy's skull under his shield rim and kicked the corpse into a cooking pit. Hrothbael ripped a spear from his own shoulder and rammed it through 2 attackers in one thrust. Vardek hacked his way straight through the center of the ambush, splitting a masked chieftain from collar to sternum and stamping on the body as he passed. There was no honor in the battle, only appetite meeting greater appetite. When the tribe broke, the warband pursued them through the pines and cut them down among the roots. Afterward they found cages. The captives inside had been stripped, nearly naked, and gnawed in places, calves and forearms carved for meat while still alive. Most were already too far gone to save, if saving had ever been a thing any of Vardek's men would consider. A few begged in thin, cracked voices. Vardek looked at them without expression, cut their throats. Some among the warband glanced uneasily at the cages, at the half-eaten bodies, at the mountains pressing close around them. The laughter had gone out of them. This journey no longer felt like a triumphal march. It felt like trespass. That unease worsened as they climbed higher. Little things began to go wrong. A warrior woke with all the nails on his left hand fallen out cleanly, leaving only wet, red crescents. Another found 3 of his teeth loose and hanging by threads of gum after chewing bread. One of the hounds bit through its own tongue for no reason and bled to death in the snow. A man called Ursik developed a weeping boil where his eye should have been, and insisted through delirium that he could see candlelight moving under the skin of the mountain. By dusk the boil burst and left behind a second eye, yellow and vertical-pupilled, which never looked at the same thing as the first. Men noticed. Men always noticed. Whispers traveled through the column like lice through furs. The signs were better in the lowlands. Maybe the thing in the barrow belongs to another. Maybe the gods don't want us here. It was Hrothbael who gave the whispers shape. Not openly. Not yet. He was subtler than that. He spoke beside cook fires and while tightening straps, in the lull after marching when men's bones ached and their thoughts grew mean. Vardek heard him say once, low but not low enough. A gift can be a brand as easy as a blessing. Another time. If the gods smile, why do we climb through shit and snow for scraps whispered by peasants? He always looked thoughtful after, almost concerned, as though he merely voiced what others were too loyal to utter. Vardek let it continue for half a day. Then, when they stopped near a frozen stream to drink and piss, he seized the loudest doubter, a broad-nosed reaver named Garm, who had laughed at Hroth's words and dragged him onto a boulder before the company. "What did you say?" Vardek asked. Garm tried to bluster. "Only that the mountain's cursed, Lord." Vardek nodded, as though considering wisdom. Then he split the man from shoulder to heart with one downward cut. Blood splashed bright across the ice. Garm's body slid in two separate directions from the stone. "The mountain is cursed," Vardek said to the silent warband. "And I am its curse." No one answered. Hrothbael's half-smile did not quite reach his eyes. They found the barrow at sunset on the 6th day. The storm had finally broken, leaving a cruel, lucid cold and a sky of bruised purple over the peaks. The path opened onto a broad shelf of rock above a gulf of shadow. There, in the center of a ring of leaning monoliths, rose the mound. It was larger than Vardek had expected. Not a simple grave hump, but a low hill of earth and stone fused hard by age, its surface furred with rime and stubborn black grass. The standing stones around it were ancient beyond reckoning, each carved with spirals, hooked runes and faces so worn they looked less like men than things seen under water. No snow settled within the ring. The ground there was bare, dark and damp as fresh-turned soil, though the air was hard enough to crack teeth. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. At the barrow's base yawned a black opening half blocked by fallen slabs. A stair descended into dark. No one spoke for a long moment. Then Scyther said, "It knows we have come." Vardek stepped between the stones. Every scar on his body prickled. The fused gauntlet on his arm pulsed once, like a heartbeat not his own. He bared his teeth. Good. They lit torches and went below. The passage stank of old earth, mold, and something faintly sweet beneath, like flowers left too long on a corpse. The stairs were cut directly into stone and slick with moisture. Their footfalls echoed strangely, often returning from directions the corridors did not lead. The walls were decorated in patches, with bas-reliefs almost consumed by time. Warriors kneeling before things with too many arms. Kings or priests with animal heads. Circles of stars bent into impossible geometries. In one niche stood a heap of skulls mortared together with black pitch. In another, a bronze bowl full of dust that stirred, though there was no breeze. The deeper they went, the warmer it became. That warmth was wrong. It had none of fire's comfort. It was the warmth of opened viscera, of breath inside a slaughterhouse. Sweat prickled under armor. Torches guttered blue. Somewhere ahead, very faint, something tapped, 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 with patient irregularity, as though a bone finger drummed on bronze. The first guardian came from the wall. One of the rearmost warriors brushed a carved panel, and the stone bulged outward around him. Hands pushed through rock, like fingers through wet hide. They were not human hands, though they had once aspired to be long, many-jointed things, with too many knuckles and nails like hooked flint. They seized the man's face and chest, and dragged him screaming into the wall. Stone flowed around him. His legs kicked twice, then vanished. The surface hardened. Only a smear of blood remained. The torchlight shook. Shapes moved inside chambers. Shriveled things in corroded armor rose from alcoves, not skeletons and not corpses, but something between. Mummified warriors, wrapped in strips of tarnished bronze and rotted leather, their empty eye sockets lit by embers, the color of bad blood. They advanced in silence, blades green, with age still sharp enough to split skin. The warband crashed into them with roars that were almost relief. Vardek met the first undead guardian head-on and smashed it apart from collarbone to hip. It came apart dryly, a bundle of leathery flesh and bone, yet even in pieces its hands scrabbled for his greaves. Cole hacked at another until the thing's head rolled away, jaw still snapping. Rothbale fought with savage efficiency, punching his axe under rusted ribs and kicking bodies back down the passage. One of the dead thrust a bronze spear through a warrior's groin and pinned him to the floor as he screamed. Another clamped its teeth on a hound's snout and would not let go until both were hacked apart. They pressed onward over the debris. The tapping sound grew louder. So did the whispering. At first it was easy to mistake for the hiss of torches or the scrape of boots, but once heard, it could not be unheard. Voices. Many, layered one over another, speaking just below comprehension. Promises, perhaps, or prayers, or obscenities uttered in tongues dead before man learned to write his own filth down. Men turned their heads sharply, trying to catch words. One slapped at his ear as if an insect crawled there. Another began to cry without noticing. The final chamber lay beneath the heart of the mound. It was round and low-roofed, supported by squat pillars carved into twisting figures that might once have represented beasts, kings, or demons, and had over time become all three. Bronze braziers stood dead around the perimeter. At the chamber's center rose a stone plinth, and on that plinth sat the relic. For a moment even Vardek was disappointed. He had imagined a sword in black crystal, or a crown of meteoric iron, or a gem full of caged fire. This was none of those things. It was a small idol, no longer than a man's forearm, fashioned from knotted bones fused together in a shape that suggested a crouching thing with too many limbs, overlaid in places with tarnished bronze that had sweated green corruption into every seam. It had no true face, only the suggestion of several faces trying to emerge from the same surface and failing. Veins pulsed faintly beneath the bone, as if blood moved in channels too deep to see. It was warm. Even from across the chamber they could feel it, and it whispered, not in one voice, but in several at once. A woman murmuring with lover-soft intimacy, a child giggling, a warrior growling praise, an old man promising secrets from broken gums. The tones braided together and unraveled, never still, each seeming for a heartbeat to address a different listener. The war band stood transfixed. Vardek strode forward and mounted the plinth. His confidence returned in a hot wave. The relic was ugly, yes, but so were truths that mattered. What was beauty to chaos? A skin overwrought. He reached for the idol with his fused hand, expecting the familiar surge of divine recognition, some answering pulse that would mark him master and chosen bearer. The moment his gauntlet touched it, the idol shuddered, not in welcome, in recoil. A deep vibration ran through the plinth, up his arm and into his teeth. The whispering changed pitch. For one instant every voice became a hiss of revulsion. Vardek's hand jerked as though he had touched a snake, and the relic rolled away from his grasp with a wet, scraping sound, stopping at the plinth's edge. Silence followed. Then one of the men behind him gagged. Another spat a tooth onto the floor. A third began cursing as the fingers of his left hand split along the joints, each knuckle opening like a rotten fruit, little slick secondary digits squirming half-formed from inside. Someone else clawed at his face, because thick yellow pus had begun to stream from both eyes. A hound went mad and threw itself against a pillar until its spine broke. Khalt stared at his own palms in horror as new hoiled fingerprints rose and sank like worms beneath the skin. The chamber filled with the stench of panic, piss, and corruption. Rothbale took one step back from the plinth. Another. He did not look at Vardek when he spoke, but everyone heard him. Maybe it knows. Vardek turned slowly. Knows what? Roth's scar-pulled half-grin flickered. That another should carry it. The chamber went still in a new and dangerous way. Vardek descended from the plinth. Each step rang like a threat, his pale eyes fixed on Roth. Behind rage, something else gnawed at him, now small, sharp, and cold. Not fear, exactly. Fear's leaner cousin. The first true bite of uncertainty, the idol whispered from behind him. Men whimpered. One tore out his own loose teeth and let them clatter across the stone. A test, Vardek told himself. Of course it was a test. The gods did not place relics in tombs for weak men to claim like trinkets from market stalls. They demanded proof, blood, severity, the iron certainty to feed others to the dark when the dark asked for more. His fury solidified around that thought, like water around a corpse in winter. A test, he said aloud. No one answered. Vardek moved with terrifying suddenness. He seized the nearest warrior, one of the younger reavers, whose eye pus had blinded him, and dragged him to the plinth. Before the man could plead, Godcleaver rose and fell. The head bounced twice and rolled into a brazier. Vardek caught the pumping body by the shoulders and upended it over the idol, letting blood sluice across the knotted bones and tarnished bronze. The whispering deepened. Another, Vardek snarled. He pointed at a second man, then a third. His chosen killers hesitated only a heartbeat before dragging them forward. One fought, one begged, one praised Vardek and the gods until the axe took his jaw away. Blood ran in thick, steaming sheets over the plinth, dripping down the carved sides in black-red ropes. Vardek scooped it up in his fused hand and smeared it over his breastplate, his helm, his face. He painted himself with it until he looked as though skinned. See me, he bellowed into the chamber. See what I offer. The idol pulsed, once beneath the gore. The torch flames bent inward toward it, as though the air itself had inhaled. Then, from somewhere in the dark beyond the chamber, whether down some forgotten passage, or in the stones, or only inside Vardek's skull, came laughter. Not one laugh, several, overlapping, male and female, shrill and bass, joyous and contemptuous all at once. It lasted no more than a breath, but every warrior in the room heard it, because every face turned pale with the same animal recognition. They were being watched. Vardek stood frozen, blood to his elbows, and felt the laughter like needles under his skin. It was not approval. It was not denial either. It was worse. It was amusement. The uncertainty inside him sharpened, but he would not show it. He snarled at the relic, wrapped it in a torn strip of skin from one of the dead, and ordered the warband to make camp in the chamber above rather than descend the mountain by night. No one argued. They were too shaken, too sick, too eager to remain inside the ring of torches and armed men, however poor that shelter was. Fires were built in dead braziers. The bodies were pushed into side passages. Guards were set, though most glanced often into the dark behind them, as if expecting the walls to breathe. The little corruptions continued. A man woke screaming because his tongue had developed a row of tiny barbs and was shredding his mouth. Another found the skin between his fingers grown transparent, showing black veins writhing underneath. Khalt coughed up a clot of grey feathers and stamped on them quickly when he saw Scyther looking. Even Hrothbale seemed quieter, though his eyes remained calculating whenever they passed from Vardek to the wrapped idol and back again. Scyther sat opposite Vardek beyond the brazier flame, her rags steaming faintly in the tomb-warm air. She held a strip of dried skin between finger and thumb and fed it piece by piece to the fire, as if reading the way it curled. "You heard it," she said. Vardek drank from a skin of stolen spirits. "I heard many things. The hungry laugh loudest when meat boasts." He stared at her over the rim of the skin. "Speak clearer, and you may keep your tongue." Her good eye glinted. "You think the relic refused you because you were not cruel enough? That is the lie pride tells when the blade slips." Vardek set the skin down hard enough to spill liquor into the dust. "I took the barrow. I fed the relic. I carry a gift on my arm and victory behind me. I am chosen." Scyther's swollen eye rolled toward the bundle holding the idol. "Chosen things are often chosen for cutting." He rose half from his seat, hand tightening on Godcleaver. The fused gauntlet hurt again, deep and hot. For one savage instant he considered splitting her in two and feeding her to the whispering dark. But the old mutant did not flinch. Her stare held him there, not fearless, but certain in a way that made violence feel suddenly insufficient. Vardek sat back down. The fire sank low. One by one the warriors collapsed into uneasy sleep, armor half buckled, weapons close to hand. Mutters and whimpers threaded the chamber. Somewhere farther back in the tomb, the tapping began again, patient, arrhythmic, impossible to place. Vardek closed his eyes at last, more from exhaustion than peace. Sleep took him like a fall. He dreamed of a plain of black snow under a sky with no stars. He stood alone upon it, bareheaded, Godcleaver gone from his hand, armor fused so tightly to him it felt grown rather than worn. At first he thought the plain empty. Then he saw movement at the edges of sight, 4 shapes pacing around him in a widening circle. They were only shadows, But each shadow was wrong in a different way. One moved with the heavy certainty of a beast too large to be natural. One flickered and changed shape with every step. One seemed to glide without touching the ground. One was thin as wire and impossibly graceful, like a knife learning to dance. They kept their distance. They did not rush him. Predators never rushed the wounded when time itself could bleed a quarry down. He turned, trying to fix one in view, and each time another was suddenly behind him. He heard breathing, he heard chuckling, he heard wings, or silk, or steel drawn slowly from a sheath. He wanted to shout a challenge, but his mouth was full of hot ashes. His feet sank deeper into the black snow with every step, until he realized it was not snow at all, but powdered bone. The shadows circled tighter. He understood then not with words, but with the cold, deep instinct men feel when the spear point is already entering them, that they were not guarding him, nor honoring him, nor waiting to crown him. They were deciding which bite to take first. Vardek woke with a roar. He lurched upright in the dark chamber, heart hammering hard enough to bruise his ribs. The braziers had burned down to sullen red eyes. Around him men snored, whimpered, or shifted in fevered sleep. A few guards stared at him in alarm. His skin was slick with sweat despite the chill. The dream clung to him like spiderweb. Then something on his chest moved, not beneath the armor this time, on him. He looked down. At some point in the night he had loosened his cuirass and fur mantle to sleep, exposing the scarred flesh of his torso to the tomb warm air. Just below his left pectoral, where old wounds and ritual cuts crossed one another in pale knots, a new shape had opened in the skin. A mouth. It was lipless and raw-looking, ringed in red folds that glistened wetly in the brazier glow. Tiny human teeth crowded the gums in irregular rows, too many for the size of it. As Vardek stared, horrified and fascinated, the thing twitched. Its jaw worked. Saliva, or some thinner, clearer fluid gleamed along the teeth. One of the guards made a strangled sound and backed away. The mouth opened wider, and in a voice that was unmistakably Vardek's own, stripped of all force and spoken in a thin, intimate whisper, it said, "They laughed because they smelled fear." Chapter 3. The guards withdraw. They came down from the barrow changed. The mountain did not care what went up it or came down from it. Its black ribs of stone and shelves of old ice remained where they had stood before tribes had names, before fortresses were timber, and prayer was smoke curling from peat fires. But the men descending its paths were not the same black-hearted reavers who had climbed toward the mound in swaggering hunger. Something had been rubbed raw in them. Something had looked back from under the earth and found them edible. The warband moved in a straggling file through thaw-slick gullies and along ledges narrow enough to scrape a shoulder bloody against the stone. Snowmelt ran in dirty veins through old drifts. Wind worried loose shale down the slopes. Above them, peaks stood under a washed sky, pale and pitiless. Below, the borderlands waited in distant folds of white and grey. Between those two immensities crawled Vardek Crane and what remained of his glory. He marched at the head as ever, but not with the old easy certainty. The relic rode, wrapped in skin and chain at his side, hanging from a hook on his belt like some butchered thing half prepared for the spit. Even through the wrappings, it radiated a low, obscene warmth. Sometimes it throbbed against his thigh in slow pulses, like a second heart buried outside his body. Sometimes It whispered in the voices of people he had killed. He ignored it, because to do anything else would have been to admit it had become the weight at the center of every thought. Under his breastplate, the mouth on his chest spoke when it pleased. He had strapped armor over it at dawn after the dream in the barrow, binding himself so tightly the steel bit his skin, but that only muffled the voice rather than silenced it. Now and then, as he marched, he heard his own buried whisper slipping through the joints of the plate. Too slow. They watch your back, not your banner. He is counting how many would follow him if you slipped. Vardek clenched his jaw so hard the hinges ached. He refused to touch the armor where the thing flexed beneath it. He refused to let the men see him favoring that side. He refused, above all, to listen. The warband was learning the smell of weakness. It started with their weapons. They made camp on a shelf of rock under a leaning cliff where old pines clung by roots like clutching fingers. The night was windless and wrong, too warm for the altitude and too still for the season. Men bedded down in sour silence. A few gnawed at stolen meat. Others muttered over dice or the cleaning of blades. Rothbale sat with his chosen killers just beyond the fire's fullest light, saying little. His scarred half-smile folded into thoughtful lines. Seetha Croweye crouched apart from them all, humming over a braid of finger bones as though plaiting a child's hair. When dawn came, and the first of the men reached for their gear, the camp filled with swearing. Spearheads bloomed orange with rust. Sword edges that had been bright the night before were scabbed brown and pitted. Axe heads crumbled in ugly flakes when touched. A helm split along its brow, as though years of weather had passed over it in a single dark hour. A warrior called Jorik drew his knife and found only a ragged spike of oxidized metal where the point had been. Witchcraft, he spat. No, said Scyther from the edge of the fire, not looking up. Attention. Vardek checked Godcleaver and found the black blade untouched. His fused gauntlet remained, slick dark and hard as ever. The sight steadied him for a heartbeat. Then he saw what the men saw. Not proof of favor, but proof of separation. Their steel failed, his did not. Once, that difference would have made them kneel. Now, it made them look at one another. Horses fared no better. By midday, 2 of the stolen mountain nags had chewed through their own reins and torn strips from the leather saddles until foam hung from their mouths in white ropes. Another had gnawed its own flank raw, ripping away hair and skin in panicked crescents. When one beast was pulled up short by a handler and beaten for the behavior, it lunged like a dog and clamped yellow teeth around the man's forearm. The bones cracked audibly before someone split the horse's skull with a mace. The fires that night burned in colors no sane hearth had ever birthed. One guttered emerald, another hissed low and blue, a third smoldered a bruised purple despite dry wood and rendered fat. The men stared into those flames as if trying to read whether they were damned or merely dying by inches. In every face Vardek saw the same pinched calculation. Their laughter had gone entirely now. Their boasts turned brittle. Every mishap, every mutation, every foul whisper from the rapt idol or his hidden mouth was another crack in the image he had spent years forging. Vardek Crane, the god's heavy hand, the invincible butcher striding toward apotheosis. Invincibility was a banner. It only had to dip once for lesser men to start wondering who might carry it next. He smelled challenge before it was spoken aloud. A man named Ulrich, One Ear, muttered that maybe the relic ought to be left in a cairn and the journey abandoned. Another suggested they make for the wastes rather than south, where temples and garrisons promised blood enough without pressing deeper under whatever gaze had started following them in the barrow. No one said the words abandoned by the gods yet. Those belonged to Hroth Baal, and Hroth was too cunning to spend them cheap. Instead, he cultivated the silence around Vardek. He stopped saluting first. Then he started answering commands after a deliberate beat, as if testing whether obedience still had to be immediate. He began distributing meat and skins among the men without waiting for Vardek's order. Small things, practical things. The sort of things a leader did when leadership was in question. On the third day down from the mountains, Vardek found one of his hounds hanging from a pine branch by its own entrails. No one knew how it had happened. The beast's belly had been opened from sternum to groin, yet there was no sign of struggle, no blood on the snow below, except a few frozen drops. Its eyes bulged from the sockets. Something had looped the slippery ropes of gut over the branch with almost ceremonial care. The hound's paws stirred in the wind. Vardek cut it down and kicked the carcass into a ravine. The mouth beneath his armor chuckled. "They're laughing at you in ways you can't hear yet." He stopped walking so abruptly, the column behind him bunched and cursed. "What?" growled Khalt, still broad as an ox but thinner now, his face greyish with poor sleep and the occasional cough of feathers he thought no one noticed. Vardek turned slowly. "Who spoke?" The men glanced at one another. No one answered. Hroth Baal raised one eyebrow, but said nothing. Vardek's gaze raked them, hunting the smirk, the tell, the twitch of insolence. He found fear, resentment, exhaustion. No speaker. The mouth whispered again, soft as a lover against his ribs. "You did." He backhanded the nearest warrior hard enough to knock out teeth. The man tumbled into a drift and lay there sputtering pink. Vardek said nothing more, only resumed marching with his cloak snapping behind him like torn skin. But the silence afterward was the silence given to unstable beasts, not to kings. That night, Hroth's challenge came. The warband had reached a broken plateau where ancient standing stones rose from the earth in a half-circle, each slab taller than a man and marked with grooves so worn by wind and age they resembled dried streams of blood. No one knew who had raised them. The mountains were full of old peoples and older sins. The place offered a ring of shelter from the wind, and so they camped there, under a moon that climbed swollen and red above the peaks, like a fresh-opened wound. The men gathered close to the fires, their shadows jerking long across the stones. Armor had been mended where it could be, though rust still clung to rivets and mail in ugly freckles. Some warriors now wore strips of cloth over new deformities. One man's fingers had fused into a crabbed claw. Another's left cheek had sloughed away in his sleep, leaving wet gums and grinning teeth visible through the side of his face. None spoke of it. All saw it in each other. Hroth Baal rose from his place and stepped into the center of the stones. He had put on his best war gear, a corselet of ringmail and plate scales, darkened by years of blood, with wolf fur hanging from one shoulder. His axe was broad-bladed and polished. The scar on his face gleamed white in the red moonlight. He did not shout to draw attention. He did not need to. The ring of men quieted around him, as if they had known this moment was ripening and were relieved at last to see it break. "Brothers?" Hroth said. A dangerous word. Not Lord, not chosen, brothers, an equal's word, or a usurper's. He turned slowly, letting the fires catch his face. We followed Vardic Krane through raids, storms, and slaughter, because the gods looked on him, and the path ahead ran red and rich. We saw omens, we saw victories, we saw a man fattened on favor. No one interrupted. Even the hounds were still. Hroth lifted one hand and gestured to the broken warband, to the rusting steel, to the malformed and coughing and pus-eyed men clustered beneath the stones. And what do we see now? Vardek was already standing before the last words had finished leaving Hroth's mouth. We see weaklings who mistake hardship for judgment, he said, stepping into the open. The red moon lacquered his armor, his breath steamed. We see men grown soft from one bad road and a few sour signs. Hroth's half-smile returned. Do we? I see rotten edges. I see fires burning like sorcerer's piss. I see men changing in ways they did not ask for. I see a relic that hissed from your hand as if it smelled spoilage. A murmur moved through the ring. Vardek's fused gauntlet tightened on Godcleaver. Measure your tongue. I measure it well. Hroth took another step, boots crunching on old frost. The gods have abandoned you. There it was at last, laid naked between them. A few men lowered their eyes. Others leaned forward. Khalt looked from one to the other with the expression of a starving dog deciding which butcher to follow. Vardek laughed, but there was no mirth in it. If they had abandoned me, you would be dead for saying that. Then kill me, Hroth said. The words hung in the red moonlight like a thrown blade. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The standing stones loomed around them, old witnesses to older murder. Wind slid between the slabs and carried the smell of frost, smoke, and the sour warmth leaking from the wrapped relic at Vardek's hip. Somewhere behind the ring, Seetha Crow-Eye watched from shadow, her pale eye fixed and glittering. Then Vardek moved first. He came in with the kind of speed men forgot large bodies could possess. Godcleaver, rising in a black blur meant to split Hroth from scalp to navel. Hroth had expected the rush. He pivoted aside, the axe head missing him by a handspan and showering sparks from a standing stone. Hroth's own weapon chopped low toward Vardek's thigh. Vardek twisted, taking the blow on cuisses and mail. Iron rang. Pain flashed up his leg. The duel became a savage whirl between the stones. Hroth was faster than Vardek remembered, or perhaps Vardek was slower. Every little uncertainty of the past days had weight now, and Hroth fought like a man who had spent those days storing up each doubt as fuel. He circled, feinted, struck where armor overlapped, where rust had worried a rivet, where fatigue pulled half a heartbeat from reaction. Vardek hammered at him in brutal, decisive arcs designed to break weapon, limb, and confidence alike. But Hroth kept slipping just clear, answering with cuts that stung and dented and accumulated. The warband roared around them, first for blood, then for names. Vardek, Hroth, a raw, animal sound with no loyalty in it, merely appetite for the strongest. Godcleaver bit Hroth's left pauldron and tore it away in a fountain of rings and leather. Hroth answered by burying his axe in Vardek's side just below the ribs, where plate had ridden up in the struggle. Not deep enough to kill, deep enough to make Vardek grunt and stagger. The wrapped relic at his belt thudded against his thigh like a second fist. Under his cuirass, The mouth on his chest writhed and laughed. "He's quicker now because you taught him where to strike." Vardek bellowed and smashed forward bodily. The two men crashed into one of the standing stones, hard enough to send a shower of old grit down around them. Khalt drove his forehead into Vardek's face. Cartilage cracked. Warm blood filled Vardek's mouth. He answered with an elbow to Hroth's throat that made the lieutenant reel. Then they were apart again, both breathing hard, both glistening with sweat under the cold moon. Hroth spat blood onto the frosted earth. "Look at them," he growled. "They're waiting." Vardek did not look. He knew it was true anyway. Hroth came in low, then high, chopping with murderous precision. Vardek parried the first and half-blocked the second, but the third feint turned into a kick that took his bad leg. He buckled. Hroth seized the opening with a snarl and drove shoulder first into him, taking him down among the roots and frozen turf between the stones. They hit the ground in a clatter of iron. Hroth was on top, one hand clawing for Vardek's throat, the other dragging his axe back for the killing blow. Moonlight glimmered on the blade. Vardek smelled blood, leather, hot breath through broken teeth. He thrust his fused arm up under Hroth's weapon wrist and held it there by brute force alone. The axe hovered, shaking. A finger's breadth from his eye slit. Hroth leaned down close, his scar twisted by effort. "They've abandoned you," he hissed. Vardek snarled and bucked, but exhaustion had turned his limbs to lead. Hroth's knees pinned his arms. The axe descended another inch. Then the mouth in Vardek's chest tore through the straps of his armor. There was a wet, ripping sound. Metal buckles snapped. The cuirass plates gaped. Raw, red flesh split open below Vardek's breastbone, and the lipless mouth burst free, glistening, its tiny human teeth slick in moonlight. It did not scream. It lunged. Hroth had only time to widen his eyes. The mouth fastened on his throat. Teeth sank deep. Not enough like a predator's bite to be clean. Not enough like a man's to be comprehensible. It chewed. It worried. It tore sideways with greedy little jerks. Hroth's scream turned instantly to a bubbling gargle. Blood sheeted over Vardek's chest and chin. Hroth thrashed, striking blindly with one fist, his axe lost. The mouth kept biting, sawing through flesh, cartilage and the red piping of the neck. One final wrench, and Hroth's throat came open in a great wet bloom. He toppled off Vardek onto the frosted earth, both hands clamped to the ruin of his neck, eyes bulging in furious disbelief. Blood pumped through his fingers in dark arcs. He tried to speak. Only a whistling hiss emerged. Then he spasmed and lay still, the red moon staring down at him like a censorious god. Silence spread around the standing stones. Not reverence, horror. The surviving warriors had seen monstrous gifts before. This was the North. Mutation was coin paid by dark powers, as often as steel or skulls. But there was something too intimate, too obscene, too plainly wrong in the sight of their warlord's own chest, unhinging to bite a rival like an animal kept under the ribs. A few men lowered their weapons, instead of raising them in acclamation. One made a sign against evil, learned in childhood, and instantly seemed ashamed of it. Khal's thick face had gone slack. No one cheered. Vardek rose slowly, slick with Hroth's blood, armor hanging open around the slick red thing that grinned and mouthed at the air. "Behold," he growled, though the word came ragged. No one knelt. That stung worse than any cut. He seized Hroth's corpse by the hair, dragged it to the nearest stone, and hewed off the head in 3 hard blows. Then he held the dripping trophy high, as if daring the warband not to understand the lesson. Still the silence remained. Not open revolt. That might have been easier. This was worse. Shrinking belief, or curdling into revulsion, the kind of fear that did not worship. Sitha Crow-Eye approached only after the others had drifted back toward the fires in nervous clumps. She stepped over Hroth's spreading blood without looking down. In the red moonlight her rags seemed woven from shadows and old bruises. The swollen white eye in her scarred face rotated slowly toward Vardek's exposed chest mouth. The mouth smiled back at her with pink, blood-slick teeth. "Interesting," she murmured. Vardek was still breathing hard. "He challenged me. He died." "He did." Her good eye lifted to meet Vardek's pale stare. "And they did not love you more for it." He flung Hroth's head aside. It struck a stone and burst at the temple like dropped fruit. "Let them fear me." "They do." Scytha's voice was flat. "Less use than you think?" Vardek wiped blood from his beard. "Speak plain, Carrion Witch." Scytha glanced up at the moon, then back to him. "You keep thinking the gods hate you." "Do they?" "No." She seemed almost amused for the first time in days. "Hate has heat. Notice has appetite. What clings to you now is colder than both." She tapped one finger against a standing stone, listening to the sound. "They are bored." The word hit him harder than Hroth's axe. Vardek started. "Bored?" "Yes." She walked a slow circle around him, taking in the open armor, the bloody mouth, the fused gauntlet, the wrapped relic hanging at his belt. "You kill, you burn, you boast. You bleed men on altars and expect the sky to clap like an audience at a mummer's show. Once that interested them, you were rising, sharp, uncertain, hungry. Now you are merely yourself, only louder." She stopped before him again. "Predictable, prideful, spiritually stagnant." His lip curled. "You dare." "I do." The bone fetishes at her wrists clicked softly as she folded her hands. "A beast may kill 10,000 sheep and still bore the butcher if it mauls them all the same way." The mouth in Vardek's chest gave a delighted little laugh. He nearly struck her then. She saw it and did not flinch. That made him want to kill her all the more. Yet beneath the fury, the words lodged like iron splinters. Bored, predictable, stagnant. None were accusations a warrior could answer by denying them. They were insults that demanded spectacle. Vardek turned away from her before he did something that would prove her right in a way he could not name. He did not sleep. Instead, he stood under the red moon until it sank, listening to the mutter of men who were no longer sure what they followed, and by dawn his course had hardened. If the gods wanted novelty, he would give them an atrocity so immense that even their jaded hunger would quicken. Not a village raid, not a border fort, not some forgotten barrow and its laughing relic. He would break a true place of devotion, a place where men still believed order meant something, and their paltry gods might shield them. He would drown its altar in blood, until every hill and stream for miles stank of sacrifice. He would build a mountain of skulls, and set the relic at its crown. He would make the world itself wince. By noon they were descending hard from the mountains toward the frontier. The warband moved like a limping wound, fewer than before and meaner. Those 2 shaken by Hroth's death stayed, because there was nowhere else to go. A few drifted away in twos during the march, slipping into pines or ravines when no one watched too closely. Vardek let them spread tales. Fear was still a kind of herald. They took what they needed from the first hamlets they found: grain, beasts, women, boys fit to carry loads, anything useful. Resisting men were nailed to doors or fed piecemeal to the hounds. A priest was made to swallow his own icons until he choked. Vardek pushed harder south, skirting roads and patrols, taking direction from terror-struck captives, until at last he heard of the temple. It stood on a hill of bare stone, where the borderland thinned into rough pasture and old forest, not grand by the standards of the great southern cities, but stout and well defended. Thick walls around a central sanctuary, barracks for a professional garrison, granaries, stables, and a bell tower visible for miles. Pilgrims and local folk brought tithes there. Refugees huddled under its protection when raiders rode. It was exactly the sort of place men trusted when the night beyond the fire felt too large. Perfect. Vardek surveyed it at dusk, from a ridge thick with thorn and dead birch. Below, the temple hill rose from the land like a clenched fist. The outer wall was of fitted stone, higher than a man, and topped with a walkway where helmed sentries paced between braziers. The gate was iron-banded oak. Within the walls, lanterns glowed in ordered rows. A whitewashed sanctuary, with a steep roof, occupied the crown of the hill, its central dome catching the last of the day's light in pale gold. Bells rang there as evening prayers began. The sound made Vardek's teeth hurt. He turned to what was left of his warband. Fewer than 40 now, many warped, all dangerous. Khalt stood near the front, feathers caught in his beard, eyes fever-bright. Others shifted restlessly, gripping damaged spears or salvaged axes, watching Vardek as gamblers watch loaded dice. "This," Vardek said, spreading his arms to the temple, "is where they remember who I am." No one cheered at first. Then a few growls rose, then more. It was not devotion, it was need. Need for plunder, for direction, for blood loud enough to drown doubt. Good enough. They attacked after nightfall. The first sentry died with God-cleaver through his spine before he could shout. The second got the alarm out half a heartbeat before Khalt ripped his jaw away. Bells began clanging wildly from the tower. Arrows hissed down from the wall walks. One took a warrior through the eye. Another pinned a hound's ear to its skull. Vardek hit the gate with a scavenged ram made from a felled pine and 3 bodies bound as cushioning. The timbers boomed. Again. Iron bands shrieked. Archers above loosed into the packed attackers, punching shafts into shoulders, necks, mouths. Then the gate split. Chaos poured through. The courtyard became a butcher's yard in heartbeats. Men-at-arms in temple colors formed ranks around the inner steps, shields interlocked, spears bristling, while militiamen and lay brothers scrambled to drag the wounded clear. White-robed priests shouted prayers over the clash. Torchlight strobed across helms and blood and stone. Vardek waded into the front rank like a thrown executioner's block, every sweep of God-cleaver smashing men from their feet. Spears scraped and glanced from his armor. One found the gap at his shoulder and drove deep. He tore it free with a snarl and killed the owner and the man beside him in one return cut. Around him, his warband crashed against discipline and tore pieces out of it by sheer savagery. Khalt vaulted a fallen shield line and buried a hatchet in a sergeant's face. A mutant reaver with a claw hand dragged an archer from the wall and broke him over the parapet. Hounds leapt for throats. Men screamed in two tongues, then one, then only, in the blunt language of dying. Still the temple did not collapse. More defenders flooded from the barracks. Crossbowmen fired from upper galleries. Hot sand poured from murder holes above the sanctuary steps. A pot of boiling oil burst among the attackers, setting two of Vardek's men aflame in shrieking orange. One ran blind into the shield wall and was pinned there with 6 spear thrusts. Vardek killed and climbed. He mounted the sanctuary steps, ankle-deep in blood, smashing through defenders one by one, his chest-mouth gibbering beneath the armor, the wrapped relic at his side pounding its obscene pulse. A priest in gilded vestments stepped before the temple doors, holding up a silver sunburst icon and shouting an invocation. Vardek split him from jaw to pelvis. The icon rang down the steps into the gore. Inside the sanctuary, incense fought a losing battle with the stink of opened bodies. Colonnades marched into shadow beneath painted vaulting. Mosaics depicting saints and victories under lawful gods glimmered under torchlight and falling ash. Refugees screamed from side aisles where they had hidden behind pews and shrines. Vardek's warriors fell on them with a starving joy that bordered on tears. Men were dragged out by the ankles. Women were cut open on the mosaic floor. A child's skull shattered under a mailed heel. The sacred air thickened with blood spray, smoke and prayers that died half-formed. At the far end of the sanctuary rose the high altar, a great block of white stone atop a dais of 7 steps. Candles burned there around bowls of oil and goldwork relic cases. Behind it stood a towering carved image of the temple's patron god, serene-faced and broad-handed, gazing down upon the chaos below with the bland confidence of a thing that had never truly expected challenge. Vardek roared at that face and bounded up the steps. He tore the altar cloth aside. He smashed reliquaries underfoot. He dragged the nearest surviving priest up by the hair and cut him ear to ear over the stone. Blood poured across the altar in a glossy sheet. Vardek spread his arms and laughed. "See me," he thundered to the rafters, to the sky beyond, to the watching dark he imagined lurking just behind the world's skin. "See what I bring." The blood slowed. It thickened unnaturally fast, darkening from red to maroon to a tarry black that clotted in ropes instead of running. It smelled wrong, not like fresh slaughter, but like a butcher's trench dug up after summer. The candles around the altar guttered green. The carved god behind him seemed to waver as heat rippled through the sanctuary. Outside, the bells changed tone. No longer alarm, no longer prayer. A deep, irregular tolling, as though struck by hands too large or too many jointed to understand rhythm. The roof beams groaned. Some of the defenders fell back in terror, crossing themselves, while others fought harder out of panic. Vardek seized another victim, then another, opening them over the altar, drenching himself and the stone in the wrapped relic, but each offering spoiled as it landed, blood clotting black, fat turning gray, flesh seeming to lose its humanness in seconds. He howled prayers, boasts, curses, and pleas until they tangled together. "I have burned for you. Take this. I am not forgotten. I broke their walls. I broke their god. Look at me, damn you. Look," the sky answered, not with words, with light. Through the sanctuary's high windows a warped radiance spilled down, impossible in color and angle, as if the heavens had split along a rotten seam and something bright, diseased, and immeasurably vast was pressing an eye to the tear. Every polished surface in the temple caught that light and bent it wrong. Gold shone bruised purple. White stone glimmered with a greenish undertone like submerged bone. Shadows stretched in the wrong direction, converging on Vardek and the altar. Men began to change around him. One of his warriors near the nave screamed as his left arm elongated to twice its length, elbow reversing, fingers multiplying in frantic little bursts until they carpeted the floor like pale spiders. Another swelled grotesquely under his breastplate, ribs pushing outward until the metal burst, and a second torso writhed half-formed from his side, moaning in a woman's voice. Cole dropped to one knee, coughing a black slurry of feathers and teeth, then lurched back up with antler-like knots thrusting through the skin of his scalp. A hound split along the spine and unfolded into something hairless and blind that immediately began eating itself. Defenders and raiders alike broke. Some fled toward the doors. Others fell prostrate. Others hacked madly at the changing things beside them. The sanctuary floor became a writhing abattoir of faith and flesh. Sitha stood in the central aisle, untouched by the worst of it, her rags snapping, though there was no wind inside. Her good eye stared at Vardek. The swollen white one tracked the rift light above. She looked almost tender. Vardek planted both hands on the altar and screamed upward until his throat tore. The mouth in his chest laughed with him, then against him. The wrapped relic burst its skin bindings and rolled free onto the blackening altar. The bone and bronze idol pulsed like a diseased organ, whispering in 4 distinct voices now, too clear to mistake. Around it the clotting blood shivered, as if trying to crawl away. For one glorious, hideous instant Vardek believed this was the threshold, that all the wrongness, all the rot, all the humiliation of the descent and Hroth's rebellion and the men's shrinking faith had been a crucible leading to this moment of transcendence. His vision swam. The split sky poured impossible light over him. The altar throbbed. The world reeled on its axis. Then the gifts came. They fell from above not as objects, but as decisions. Pain hit first, total and intimate. It did not strike him from outside. It erupted within, as though every hidden possibility in his body had awakened, hungry and furious. He threw back his head and roared, while his armor began to bulge. Something punched outward through his left side with a wet metallic shriek. Another arm smaller than his own but thick and clawed forced its way through mail and flesh together, scattering rings and gobbets of meat across the altar. Bone cracked, tendons twanged. Before he could comprehend that, another growth surged under the skin of his back and burst upward through the gaps at his shoulders. At first he thought them horns. Then they kept growing and branching in slick, cartilage-white antlers, soft and glistening like unborn things dragged into moonlight. He staggered, but did not fall. His shoulder plate split. Lamprey mouths opened where deltoid muscle had been, round and puckered, ringed in rasping teeth. They worked wetly at the air, snapping and sucking, dribbling blood-flecked slime down his arms. Vardek clawed at one with his fused gauntlet and felt it bite the metal. He screamed louder. His palms burned. He looked down and saw the skin there ballooning outward in translucent bubbles. They burst not into blood but eyes, small at first, milky and blinking, then swelling to full size. irises blooming black-purple in the centers. Each new eye rolled wildly, showing him fragments of the sanctuary from impossible angles. The roof beams above, the writhing hound thing at his feet, Scyther's face in the aisle, his own reflection bent in a fallen gold dish. Still he did not die. That was the cruelty. Not death, awareness. He felt every tear of flesh, every slip of new muscle knitting under split skin, every impossible rearrangement of his frame, his jaw unhinged and reset. Vertebrae popped like knuckles being cracked by giant hands. The mouth in his chest shrieked with ecstatic laughter until it was drowned out by Vardek's own voice collapsing into wordless agony. Around him the temple was coming apart. Men fled burning. Others crushed each other at the doors. The carved god behind the altar split down the middle and fell in two slow halves into the black gore. The sky rift above pulsed once, and all the unnatural colors in the sanctuary flared so bright they carved after images into every eye. When the light ebbed, Vardek was still standing, barely. His armor hung from him in twisted strips around a body no smith or mother had intended. The extra arm flexed convulsively at his side. Cartilage antlers dripped translucent fluid onto the altar. Lamprey mouths worked in his shoulders with blind, eager hunger. The eyes in his palms blinked independently, never all closing at once. His chest mouth grinned beneath the ruin of his cuirass. Blood his, others, all mixed, now steamed black around his boots. He waited for ascension. For wings, perhaps, for fire, for the lifting sensation of mortal clay finally sloughing away. Nothing came, no crown of dark radiance, no voice naming him immortal, no elevation, only more pain, more wet breathing through mouths he had never owned, more consciousness trapped inside flesh that had become a jest. He was still himself, still aware, still not dead. Chapter 4. Spawnhood. The temple died around him in stages. First came the bells. They had been tolling in warped, arrhythmic peal since the sky had split above the sanctuary, but now their voices changed again, sagging from bronze command into something cracked and hysterical. Each note seemed to wobble in the air, to bend and smear like fat sizzling on a hot stone. The sound rolled down through the smoke and dust and blackened light, through the rafters and colonnades and blood-slick aisles, and with every stroke of those failing bells, another piece of order seemed to loosen in the place. Then came the fire. It had begun as spilled torches and overturned braziers, small practical blazes among torn hangings and smashed pews. Now it found incense oil, lamp fuel, altar cloths, dry timber hidden in the bones of the roof. It spread with greedy color, not clean orange, but bruised violet in one place, corpse blue in another, a crawling green around the sanctuary steps where fat and blood ran together in little rivers. It climbed carved pillars in shivering tongues. It licked the falling halves of the split idol behind the altar. It turned the high-painted saints into blistering masks whose calm eyes melted down their own cheeks. Then came the screaming. Men-at-arms, pilgrims, priests, reavers, hounds, malformed things that had once been all of those. Every throat that could still shape terror contributed to the ruin. Some shrieked because they were burning, some because they were being trampled at the doors, some because their limbs no longer belonged to them or their mouths had multiplied, or their eyes had opened in places that should have remained shut forever. The sound filled the temple, until it became less a noise than a weather of agony. At the center of that weather, atop the black slick altar, Vardek Crane still stood. He did not stand as a man stood. He listed and lurched, one knee half-buckled, shoulders uneven, under the burden of things that had no right to grow from them. His armor had become a cage burst from within, rings of mail hanging from new flesh, plates split and peeled back like flower petals around raw muscle and cartilage. The extra arm jutting from his left side flexed with blind, clenching motions, its clawed hand opening and closing as if grasping for a weapon or a throat. The antlers of wet white cartilage branching from his back and scalp shone slickly in the warped light. The lamprey mouths in his shoulders suckered and gnashed at the smoky air. His palms had eyes now rolling, black-purple, wetly blinking eyes that saw too much and understood none of it. He was still conscious. That was the final indignity, not to be remade in an instant and let the old mind vanish into blessed nonsense, but to remain pinned inside the process, like a prisoner bolted into an iron maiden while it was forged around him. He felt every motion of his new body with a terrible intimacy, the grinding of altered joints, the stretch and pull of fresh nerves, learning the language of alien limbs, the slick hunger of the mouths in his shoulders, the cool blink of the eyes in his palms when ash landed on them. Beneath the rent breastplate, the lipless mouth in his chest grinned and muttered his thoughts before he could own them. Not ascension. Never ascension. Vardek tried to answer with a roar, and what came out of him was a torn bellow of rage, layered with a bubbling hiss from somewhere deeper in the throat. His own voice, and something trying to learn it. Below the altar steps, the last shape of discipline in the temple dissolved. The surviving defenders had stopped trying to hold ranks. Men who minutes earlier had locked shields and died properly for altar, and God now fled in ones and threes, slipping in blood, casting aside helms and spears just to move faster. Priests ran clutching torn vestments and silver icons blackened by soot. One old brother tried to drag the temple standard clear of the fire, only to have a mutant reaver fall on him from behind and chew his face to gristle through broken teeth and a new sideways mouth in his cheek. A woman with a child in one arm reached the sanctuary doors, only for the crowd there to surge backward and crush both of them against the frame. Mercenaries who had sold their swords to the temple garrison hacked wildly at anything that moved, not from courage, but because panic had stripped them down to the old beast beneath every oath. Vardek saw all of it in fragments. One palm eye showed him Khalt staggering through the nave, with feather-streaked gore in his beard, antler knots fully breaking through his scalp now, using a severed pew leg as a club because his axe hand had swollen into a horny mass of knuckles. Another eye caught the wrapped relic no longer wrapped, no longer still tumbling from the altar into the black blood at his feet and pulsing there like an exposed organ. Another saw the doors giving way under the crush. Another showed Sitha Crow-Eye standing motionless in the central aisle, while madness ran around her like floodwater around a gravestone. His famed black axe, God-Cleaver, had fallen from his fused hand at some point in the first convulsion. It lay halfway down the altar steps, where it had struck stone hard enough to chip the edge of the stair. For one instinctive moment Vardek reached for it. His new arm reached too. So did one of the mouths in his shoulder, lunging forward with a wet snap. The movement threw him off balance. He stumbled down the steps in a crash of steel fragments and bone-white antlers. A defender in mail saw him fall and mistook the stumble for weakness. The man was young, broad-shouldered, temple sword still bright despite the filth around him, and brave enough to charge the thing that Vardek had become. He shouted some prayer to his orderly gods and drove his blade two-handed toward Vardek's exposed side. The sword went in. Pain flashed hot and precise, a pure human pain for a blessed instant amid all the greater wrongness. Vardek seized the young man by the wrist with his original hand and by the throat with the clawed new one. The extra fingers bit deep, penetrating gorget and flesh. He lifted the defender from the ground. The lamprey mouths in his shoulders shivered, and then one fastened to the man's face. It did not bite, in any clean, martial sense. It clung. Its ring of rasping teeth worried flesh away in a wet circle, while the man kicked and screamed and beat at Vardek's arm. Skin peeled. One eye burst. Blood and saliva sprayed. Vardek felt the shoulder-mouth feeding and understood with sick clarity that he had not commanded it. The body was learning appetites of its own. He hurled the defender into a column hard enough to break the spine. The corpse folded and slid down, leaving a broad red smear. Vardek reeled the other direction, slamming through a shrine niche. Little painted images of saints and protectors shattered around him. His antlers caught a hanging censer and tore it free. Hot coals sprayed into the rushes. A side chapel curtain ignited in blue fire. Everywhere he turned, destruction followed. He lurched across the sanctuary like a siege engine gone rabid. He knocked over candelabra and smashed reliquaries beneath feet no longer shaped for graceful movement. He tore a carved screen in half, trying to steady himself. He crushed a kneeling cultist, one of those carrion souls that always gathered where horror broke the world, hoping to suck favor from the edges of catastrophe without even noticing until the body burst wetly underfoot. Men stabbed at him from behind, emboldened by the sight of him floundering, only to have tentacular strands of half-formed muscle whip out from rents in his back and slap their faces into mush against the floor. Others fled outright, tripping over corpses, over pews, over each other. His former followers were the worst of all. Some ran from him with the blind loyalty of prey that still feared being noticed. Some, maddened or opportunistic, saw glory in finishing what the gods had begun. One Reaver, with a split jaw and a stolen temple mace, yelled Vardek's name as though in salute, and then swung for his head. The blow glanced off a cartilage antler and shattered the growth in a spray of translucent splinters. Vardek's chest-mouth shrieked. The extra arm snatched the Reaver by the groin and tore him apart from crotch to breastbone in one ghastly jerk. Another tried for Godcleaver on the steps, perhaps believing possession of the axe might transfer whatever remained of Vardek's old authority. Before he could grasp the haft, a tentacle of slick red flesh, newly extruded from beneath Vardek's shoulder blade, lashed across the distance and broke the man's neck with a sound like green wood splitting. Khalt came closest. He climbed the sanctuary steps through smoke and bodies, antlers bleeding, one eye swollen shut with black discharge. Even now he was huge, though hunched by mutation and streaked with soot. He still carried a brute's loyalty toward the memory of Vardek, if not the thing itself. "Lord!" he shouted over the roar of fire and bells. "Lord, hear me!" Vardek turned toward the voice. For one thin, miraculous instant, something in him recognized the word, Lord. He remembered ridges above Khalt and men roaring his name into the storm. He remembered the old easy weight of Godcleaver in his hand, and the certainty that the world had a shape with him near the top of it. He tried to answer. What came from his mouth was skulls, followed by a choking gargle as a new jaw hinge shifted under the skin. Khalt took another step, hope or stupidity bright in his one good eye. "We can cut our way free! We can!" The relic at Vardek's feet pulsed. It rolled against his greave with warm insistence, then struck the black gore of the altar like a dropped heart. Something in that touch, that obscene little nudge from the object he had crossed mountains to claim, snapped the thread of recognition. Vardek saw not Khalt the long-serving butcher, but only a moving shape between him and pain. One of the eyes in his palm fixed on Khalt's throat. One of the shoulder mouths hissed. The tentacles along his back coiled. Khalt saw the change too late. Vardek charged. The collision hurled both of them down the steps. Khalt swung the pewleg club once and cracked it across Vardek's temple, opening skin and exposing white beneath. Vardek answered with the extra arm, driving its claw through Khalt's breastplate and into the chest beyond. Ribs gave. Khalt roared through a mouth full of feathers and blood and stabbed blindly upward with a knife he had palmed in the struggle. It vanished into the writhing meat of Vardek's side and emerged red-black from somewhere else entirely. Neither seemed to notice. They rolled in slaughter and splinters while smoke thickened above them. Then the lipless mouth in Vardek's chest latched onto Khalt's ear and tore the side of his head away. Khalt convulsed. The tentacles tightened around his limbs. The lamprey mouth on Vardek's right shoulder fixed on his neck. When Vardek lurched upright again, Khalt came with him for a heartbeat, dangling from the feeding mouth, then tore free in strips. He hit the floor and did not rise. The antlers on his head twitched once, twice, then were still. Vardek stared down at the ruin of the man who had followed him across years and slaughter. If any grief still existed in him, it had no shape left that a human face could recognize. He only felt a pressure in the skull, a hot animal confusion, and then the pressure was drowned by another convulsion. More of him burst loose. A rope of muscle uncoiled from his spine and thickened as it hit the air, becoming a tentacle plated in shards of embedded mail. Another followed, then another, whipping and striking at random. One smashed a reliquary open, scattering finger bones and gemstones. One caught the temple standard, wrapped around it, and yanked so hard the staff broke in the middle. One lashed across the altar and sent the pulsing relic spinning through the air. It struck the fallen halves of the temple's patron idol and disappeared into the rubble. That made Vardek scream. He did not know why. The relic had become no master's badge, no crown. It had recoiled from him, mocked him, led him downward by the throat. Yet the sight of it lost among the debris sent him into a frenzy more violent than any before. He plunged through the smoke toward the broken idol, tearing apart his own path. The idol's carved face shattered under his bulk. He ripped off a stone arm and beat a kneeling cultist to paste with it. He tore aside fallen beams with 4 grasping limbs, now where 2 had once sufficed. He smashed open the treasure chest of offerings he himself had piled there earlier. Coins, chalices, silver chains, severed heads, all the gaudy signs of mortal victory, until wealth and trophies mingled in the blood and ash under his feet. His banners burned nearby, the flayed cloth strips taken from conquered foes over a dozen campaigns. They curled and blackened in the heat, emblems erased by flame. Trophies he had worn from tribe chiefs and mercenary captains bounced and skittered away in the collapse. A chain of shriveled fingers burst when a beam fell on it. A horned helm, taken from a rival champion months before, cracked straight down the crest. Every token of triumph he had prized, every proof of status and remembered violence, was being ground into the same choking ruin as the temple itself. He lashed out at them all, at the idols, at the trophies, at the remnants of his own legend. This, too, felt like punishment. Not some clean sentence pronounced by a god, but a degradation, an insistence that nothing he had built in the shape of Vardek Krane should survive the making of what came next. Seetha moved toward him through the smoke. It seemed impossible that she still lived. The sanctuary roof had begun to sag where beams burned through. Flaming thatch and broken tiles rained into the nave. Men still trapped near the doors died under panic boots. Others, driven half-mad by mutation, crawled and gnawed and prayed to things too low or too distant to hear them. Yet the rag-wrapped seer crossed that ruin with the same patient gait she had shown in mountain passes and charnel feasts, stepping over bodies, under falling embers, through blood that no longer looked entirely human. She came within 10 paces of Vardek and stopped. He towered over her now, not just in height but in mass, a convulsing mound of armor and raw, proliferating flesh. His head had sunk deeper between the shoulders. One antler had split and regrown into a fan of cartilage hooks. The eyes in his palms rolled constantly. Tentacles dragged and whipped around him, leaving streaks in ash. The mouth in his chest muttered without pause, a stream of broken boasts, obscenities and private fears in Vardek's own ruined voice. Seitha lifted her chin. "Vardek," she said. At the name, several of his mouths turned toward her. The original one hung slack and blood-wet. The chest mouth grinned. A new slit had opened low on his flank and whispered something wetly obscene. His tentacles thrashed, but not yet toward her. Somewhere inside all that, the remnants of the man still listened. "You wanted them to speak," Seitha said. "This is their answer." He took a step. Stone cracked beneath the altered weight. "Kill!" he managed, then snarled, then beat one claw against his own chest as if trying to crack it open and reach himself. A good eye held his. "No. Listen. Not because it will save you." A beam collapsed behind her, in a fountain of sparks. She did not turn. "They never owed you a crown. They gave you hunger and called it favor. They gave you attention and let you mistake it for love. Now they unmake what grew dull in their sight." She tilted her head, almost pitying. "That is all?" Vardek wanted to deny her. He knew he did, because some ember of the old pride still flared at being spoken to like a beaten hound. He wanted to tell her of Khalt, of the blood runes in the snow, of carrion birds circling in sacred shapes, of a gate smashed inward by one glorious shoulder. He wanted to recite the ledger of his murders and offer them as arguments against this humiliation. He wanted to scream that he had earned something better than this. Instead, his chest mouth said, "Bored," and then laughed. The sound that tore from his real throat afterward might once have been rage. It might have been grief. It might simply have been the noise of too much flesh trying to remember a single human feeling and failing. He lunged. Seitha was quick in the way of old scavenger birds. She slipped aside rather than back, letting a tentacle smash the floor where she had stood. Stone exploded. A second lash of flesh caught her rags and tore them, exposing the scar-scrawled thinness beneath. She did not flee immediately. She stayed just beyond the reach of the snapping mouths and said, with sudden harsh force, "Remember your name." Vardek crashed into a pillar. Marble split. The roof above it shuddered. Dust and sparks rained down. He dragged himself free in a groaning avalanche of broken stone. The mouth in his side babbled. The eyes in his palms blinked against grit. He swung again, blind, and smashed apart a processional statue. The broken face of a saint spun across the floor and stopped at Scyther's feet. "Remember," she repeated. He answered with fragments. "Ward, ear, skulls for, burn." Old war cries, pieces of identity, splinters, each one drowned by snarls, by the wet chatter of the newer mouths, by the sucking hunger of the shoulder maws, by the crack of bones shifting under skin. Scyther saw it happen in real time. The man trying to force words through a body increasingly uninterested in language. A section of the sanctuary roof gave way then with a thunderous roar. Flaming beams and tiles came down across the dais and altar, crushing what remained of priest, idol, and offering alike. The black blood on the altar hissed into steam. Fire gusted through the chamber with the appetite of a forge. Men still alive in the nave screamed and vanished under falling timbers. One of Vardek's tentacles was pinned beneath a beam and thrashed violently, tearing free only by leaving a long strip of its own flesh behind. Scyther made her choice. She backed away at last, step by measured step, never turning her gaze entirely from the creature that had been Vardek Crane. Her lips moved in some muttered phrase that was not blessing and not farewell. She retreated into the smoke of the aisle, into the collapsing dark beyond, and though Vardek lurched after her once, twice, the ruin of the temple itself intervened. Fire, bodies, stone, and the increasing rebellion of his own changing mass. By the time he reached the sanctuary doors, she was gone. He burst out into the temple courtyard, beneath a sky gone nearly black. The split in the heavens had sealed or moved or become invisible to mortal eyes, but it had left its stain. Clouds rolled low and bruised over the hilltop. Ash fell like diseased snow. Rain began in fat. Cold drops that hit the blood-warm stones and sent up little ghosts of steam. Fires still crawled along the roofs of the barracks and bell tower. The bells themselves had finally gone silent, one broken free and lodged crooked in its frame, the other tolling only when the collapsing timbers struck it by accident. The yard was chaos in its purest mortal form. Survivors ran everywhere, temple soldiers dragging wounded comrades, reavers hauling stolen sacks and chests, only to abandon them moments later when some newer horror lunged from the smoke. Maddened cultists capering bareheaded in the rain, laughing and slashing at each other in ecstasies of terror. Horses loose from the stables, kicking and screaming with eyes rolled white. One already half transformed into a long-necked mockery that bit chunks from the flank of another. The dead lay mixed together in heaps against walls and troughs and the base of the gate, all distinctions of allegiance flattened by the common argument of slaughter. When Vardek emerged, the yard paused around him. Not literally. Men still ran, fires still burned, rain still fell, but in the minds of those who saw him, a silence opened. He was no longer even a warped champion, no longer a man with unfortunate blessings. He was a verdict of flesh. Tentacles trailed and lashed from him in bunches now, some slick and bare, some ringed in fragments of armor, one ending not in a taper but in a hand that clawed at the air with frantic independence. His legs had thickened unevenly, one digitigrade and jointed backwards, the other swollen and half-hoofed, making his gait a horrible slither lurch. The extra arm had grown larger than the original and dragged close to the ground, its knuckles scraping sparks from stone. Mouths worked across him in shoulder, chest, flank, and along the base of the neck, each with different teeth and different appetites. Eyes stared from palms, forearm, one thigh, and the side of his jaw where the skin had thinned almost clear. His head was still, in some cruel proportion, recognizably Vardek's bearded, scarred, pale-eyed under all the ruin, so that those who had followed him could not even grant themselves the mercy of mistaking the creature for something wholly new. He rampaged because there was nothing else left for him to do. Not a charge, not a battle plan, a nightmare chase. He barreled through the courtyard, smashing men aside whether they fled or fought. A mercenary with enough nerve to aim for the eye slit in Vardek's battered helm found himself snatched up and used as a bludgeon against two others. A pair of cultists threw themselves at him chanting praises, hoping perhaps to be noticed by the same powers that had made him. He trampled one, and the tentacles opened the other, from groin to throat, before he could finish the second syllable. Defenders loosed crossbows from the gate tower, bolts thunking into the fleshy mass and vanishing there with little visible effect. One struck an eye in his upper arm. It burst. 3 more opened along the same limb in answer. Still aware, still not dead. That was the refrain, pounding through whatever mind remained to him. He smashed through the gate at last, not by strategy, but by sheer collapsing weight, bringing part of the weakened wall down with him. Stone and timber tumbled outward into the churned mud beyond the temple hill. Rain turned ash and blood to black slurry. Bodies rolled beneath the collapse and vanished. Vardek hauled himself through the gap amid falling rubble, dragging one pinned tentacle, leaving strips of skin, mail and gristle, caught on splintered beams. Outside the walls, the hill sloped down toward rough pasture and the beginning of the border wilds. The storm had thickened properly now. Lightning flickered behind the clouds without striking. The darkness between the trees at the hill's base looked deep enough to swallow kingdoms. Survivors who had escaped the temple were already scattering into it in all directions, specks in the rain, each convinced distance might negotiate what prayer could not. Some tried to pursue him. There were always such men. Glory hunters, desperate fools, warriors who believed that slaying a monster might wash failure from them or gild their names. 3 temple soldiers and 2 mercenaries came after him across the mud, shouting to steady themselves, blades up. One hurled a spear that sank into a writhing shoulder and was immediately chewed apart by the lamprey mouth there. Another closed enough to hack at a tentacle, severing the tip. The severed piece flopped in the mud like a fish, and then began blindly dragging itself toward his boot. Vardek turned on them. The old battle sense did not guide him now. Something lower did. He crashed among the pursuers in a rain of mud and blood, tearing, biting, whipping. One man disappeared entirely beneath the convulsing mass. Another was hurled into a standing hitching post so hard his torso opened from spine to navel. A mercenary found Godcleaver half buried near the broken gate, perhaps flung there in the chaos, and raised it in both hands with a cry of triumph. The axe was too heavy for him, too strange. It dragged his arms down, unbalancing him. Vardek, or the thing wearing the last outlines of Vardek, saw the black blade in another's grasp and made a sound so hideous that even the storm seemed to flinch. He lunged. Tentacles seized the mercenary's legs and wrists and pulled in opposite directions. The man came apart around the haft of Godcleaver, which fell from his hands and landed point first in the mud. There it stood for a moment, the famed black axe that had broken gates and skulls and border shrines, the old emblem of Vardek's terrible favor. Rain ran down its crescent blade. Mud climbed slowly around the lower edge. The creature did not reclaim it. Perhaps it no longer knew how. Perhaps the arm that had once wielded it had lost the shape required. Perhaps the irony was part of the sentence written into him by powers too spiteful to waste a detail. Whatever the reason, he left it there. He dragged himself down the far side of the hill and into the dark. Behind him, the temple continued to burn and collapse, a red and violet wound glaring through rain. Shouts dwindled. Bells gave one final broken note and were still. Men would remember that night for years, in border forts and winter halls, though memory would gnaw at itself trying to decide what exactly had walked from the flames. Some would swear it had once been a chaos lord. Others would deny that, because the thought was too ugly. A few would tell of the axe left in the mud, and make of it a relic, a warning, a prize. Vardek heard none of it. He moved through the border wilds, as a thing in pain moves without grace, without dignity, drawn onward by the simple need to get away from the place where the last pieces of itself had burned. He crashed through thorn scrub and low pines, leaving gobbets of himself on branches, the mouths across his body, fed on rain and blood, and one another's muttering. The tentacles dragged furrows in the earth. Once he reared at the sudden shape of a standing stone half buried in the heather, seeing in it for a deranged instant the old ring under the red moon where Hrothbale had declared the gods had abandoned him. Then he smashed past it and kept going. The storm deepened over the hills. By dawn he was in the wasteland fringe again, where the land grew harsher, meaner, more honest in its malice. Black rock jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The pools were crusted green even in cold weather. Carrion birds watched from crags and did not come near. Things hidden in gullies and burrows heard his passage and chose to remain hidden. He no longer resembled a leader, or even prey worth straightforward pursuit. He was becoming weather of a certain ugly sort. Days, perhaps, passed, or hours stretched sickly long. Time lost usefulness in that body. The changes did not stop. They never meant to stop at man's edge. The recognizable Vardek face sank under further growths and asymmetries. The beard tore out in clumps where new mouths opened. The original eyes were joined, crowded out, or swallowed by larger, stranger ones. Legs shortened and multiplied. The torso thickened. Armor fragments embedded themselves permanently into swelling flesh. The relic from the barrow, somehow not lost after all, worked its way back into him by means no sane anatomy could permit. Pieces of tarnished bronze and knotted bone appeared lodged beneath translucent skin, jutting from shoulders and flank, like grisly jewelry grown from within. With each step the last coherent grammar of his body degraded further, yet somewhere in there, buried under feeding mouths and whipping limbs, there remained long enough a memory of snow hissing into runes, a ridge above a settlement, a gate bursting inward, a certainty like sunlight on cold iron. That memory did not save him. It only made the distance more obscene. By the time he vanished fully into the wastes, Vardek Crane was gone in every way the world knew how to count. What moved there was a chaos spawn, a huge and gibbering mass of armored flesh, writhing tentacles, gnashing mouths, and embedded relic shards, forever unfinished and forever overripe, driven by appetites too fragmentary to satisfy, and reflexes too violent to rest. Other champions might one day track it through the shale ravines and poisoned snowfields, hunt it for sport or favor, or the simple joy of killing something more cursed than themselves. They would circle it with spears and laughter, never knowing that the thing they baited into rage had once worn a warlord's cloak of flayed banners and dreamed of daemonhood. Outside the ruins of the temple, meanwhile, the rain turned the hill to mud. There Godcleaver remained, half buried where it had fallen, its black blade slick with filth and ash, the symbol of a champion's favor abandoned to weather and scavengers. Beyond it, in the storm-dark hills, something huge and wet crashed away into the wastes.